Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And I have some kind of hysterical news for you.
Hysterical news?
Well, no, actually not hysterical. Just hysterical in that it's funny to me that we will have now mentioned this, I think in like 3 or 4 or 5 episodes that were so didn't. Anyway, okay, here's
okay, why don't we just jump right in?
Yeah, deep breath. Let's focus here. So several episodes ago, we made a big deal about it being like the end, like right near the end of our first season, because it was episode 51. And then we was like, well, this is the episode 52 is the first episode. But then we were like, well, maybe not. Maybe 52 would be the 52nd week. So that'd be the last one of the first season. So 53 was really, that would be this one, would really be the first one of the new episode.
Right.
But
Except
I looked at the date because it was confusing because I know we started on June 20th last year. So I'm like, well, how could it be our first year done if it's only like May 29th or something? And so I looked back and I remember the thing we forgot was we launched with like 2 or 3, like several episodes. So the episode number is not the indicator. So basically everything we said before about it being like the end of our first year is wrong.
So the first year is really a 56-week year.
Well, 56 episodes. 56 episodes, not 56 weeks.
No, I prefer to think of it as 56 weeks. And here's why. Because I like to think that what we did was a major thing as opposed to just like a wrinkle in time kind of thing. Oh,
I see. Like we've bent the time continuum
as opposed to just miscounted.
Space-time.
It's so much better.
I like that a lot better.
Yeah.
So anyway, for better or for worse, episode 53, the current episode you were listening to, is, as near as I can tell, officially the last episode of our first full year of producing podcasts.
But it's still correct to say that we have been picked up for a second season.
That is true.
Great.
And next week, when the episode comes out on June 19th, that will be, I believe, the first episode of our new season, unless it's the last one of the first one. Whatever. We're just going to pretend.
I just want to make sure that our entire, our team of writers and producers can still report to work because we've been picked up for season 2.
We've definitely been picked up. And on the off chance this is the first time someone has ever listened to an episode, I hope they made it thus far and they're not like, oh my God, this is boring. What are we talking about? All right. So back to regular business.
Yes.
Would you like to thank our sponsors?
Yes. I'd like to thank Tom Loveland at Mind Over Machines, Cat's Copy, the architecture firm of GWWO, and Mary Craft Staffing and HR Solutions. Okay,
so I have a story. I'm not happy about this story, but I'm going to go with it.
Okay.
All right. So here's my story, and I say that with some sort of grumble in my voice because so I'll be honest, so this is just like a personal quirk. Things like so in the past few weeks or the last month or so, or whatever, this like Yanni Laurel thing is going around Facebook. And I'll admit, like I literally
Please tell me that's not your story.
No, it's not. Well, no, it sort of, but no.
Okay.
So my story is that I actually don't even click on, like I just don't even, I didn't pay attention to the blue dress, whatever.
The gold dress, blue dress.
I don't know why I'm so resistant to them, but something about the fact that they're making, like, there's such a hubbub over them makes me want to ignore them and not be a part of it. I don't know. That probably says more about me than it does.
Well, no. And when you look at it, or when I look at it, because I'm right there with you, I think, could there be anything less important than this?
I mean, that's part, it brings out this like, who cares part of me. So the fact that I am using my precious, podcast time to refer to it, like physically hurts me a tiny bit. But anyway, I've been thinking about it a lot lately, even though I hadn't listened. And I did go ahead and listen to it before we came, just because I felt like if I was going to use it, I have to actually have listened to it.
Makes sense. Are we going to have to pause this episode so I can listen to it?
No, you haven't listened to it? Well, maybe. We'll see. We'll see if we need it. Anyway, so I hadn't actually spent any time listening to it. Frankly, don't really care about it, but it has come into my head 10 or 15 times in the last few days because I spent several hours yesterday with a couple different people, 2 sets of 2 people in an organization doing what I have lovingly begun to refer to and referenced here before as like business couples therapy.
Sure.
These are people who are good people who actually care about the same things, but for a variety of different kinds of reasons, they are just not getting along. They're not and more than not getting along, they're actually, and sometimes have created even like toxic situations. And I, for whatever reason, I seem to be really good at helping people in that situation. And what feels important about this to me, feels important enough to actually bring it up to podcast, is that I think there's a really profound, you said what could be more, what could mean less than this?
Yes.
I actually now, with great snarl on my face, point to something incredibly profound about these gold dress, blue, whatever the colors were, the dresses and the Yanni Laurel thing. And that is, to me, if two people can listen to something as simple as like a little audio clip and have completely different experiences of it. And it's such a simplistic version. Like there are no other variables to argue there. It's like you either heard it or you didn't. You see
there's no other baggage. There's no he said this, but you did that.
There's no complexity. Yes. There's no nuance. There's no like, well, you have to consider this. It is the simplest, most binary version of a test. I mean, so infrequently in the world do we get to like isolate a variable like this. And the undeniable importance of this to me is, if we can have such a different experience of a single audio clip and a unreconcilable difference, like somebody will be like, I can only hear Laurel or I can only hear Yanni. To me, it shines the light on a much needed respect for how often that is exactly what's happening in more complex and more nuanced situations. Which is exactly what I'm untangling when I work with these folks, because that's almost exactly what's happening. They are having a Yanni Laurel moment. Like they have gone through the exact same experience together, and they have come out with wildly different movies playing in their head of what happened. And they're wanting to make like my right equals your wrong or if you're right, that means I'm wrong. And I think, there's something so important about expanding our awareness to the fact, whether we like it or not, whether it makes it more complex even, that we see and experience things differently. And that is a variable we cannot ignore.
Well, I think that what's interesting, one of the things that I wanted to show you, and we're going to have to post this in the SHMS community on Facebook, is there's a script version of it. So if you take a look at it, you can look at the script and you can see
that's
one or the other one written out. But what I understand the determining factor is for whether you hear Yanni and Laurel is biological. There's a frequency that you can hear. You either hear higher frequency or lower frequency or what have you. And so to take your point about how people can see the same thing physically, but come out of it with a completely different interpretation of what they just witnessed. There, it's not biological, but you're still seeing it through the lens of your experience, or maybe the previous slight that you have, or your ambition, or who the actors are in this particular play.
That is true, but I also think it's entirely possible some of it's biological. I mean, in certain ways, like I have often wondered if we all there's no way for us to know if we see colors differently. Like I'm sitting here drinking out of this blue mug. You and I have both know that from babies, we've been taught that this color is blue. So you will agree it's blue and I will agree it's blue. That doesn't mean that if I could see through your eyes, you may be seeing the color that I call green or orange or something. There's no way to figure that out, but there's no way to know what experiences. My son thinks that, I told him one time, he likes kale and broccoli, and which is bizarre. There's like two of his favorite things. And I said, you should try Brussels sprouts because I think you would like them. He's like, why do you think I'd like them? I'm like, well, they're sort of like broccoli. They're like a dark, not bitter, but like that darker flavor. And he goes, what are you talking about? He goes, kale and broccoli are sweet. And I was like, what? I mean, I love kale and broccoli, but they are not sweet. Like, I think he tastes things differently. And so those are just sort of curiosities I have, but there's a very real biology that is distinctive. And that is what your, is your vagal, I forget what it is. It's this nerve, it starts with a VAG. I can't remember the last two letters. This nerve that you have that sparks when you have like a fight or flight, like when your value feels threatened, when you feel like when you become defensive, and the degree to which that happens, your fight or flight response actually takes blood out of that part of your brain that can think more clearly.
Yes.
And you're in much more of a biological reptilian kind of state. So there is a biology to how you process information in that moment, what you're even able to take in or notice or accept.
I think there's certainly a biology to, which leads into a whole different thing. There's a biology to whether somebody is able to process their way out of a situation, because they're no longer thinking a certain way. They're no longer capable of thinking beyond the fight or flight. The immediate perception, the Malcolm Gladwell blink, what you see in the blink of an eye, what you hear in Yanni versus Laurel, what you see in the script. What's interesting to me is that's biological, whereas in a policy debate or in a debate about roles, who plays what role in an organization, I think a lot of times what you come to is a perspective that's based on history and not based on what's happening in the present. And so that's the interesting thing. And just to go back to your point about the blue mug, there was a series of studies done. I wish I could be more specific than that, but there were a series of studies done with people who had been blind, but who had their sight regained. And they were given certain shapes while they couldn't see, and they could feel them with their hands, but then they were utterly unable to, when they had their sight back, they were utterly unable to match up what they had felt with what they now see in front of them. And because they had never, and the reason that it's important that these people had been blind as opposed to just wearing dark glasses is because you're raised, if you're a sighted person, you're raised and you know that this is a pyramid or this is a whatever, but they couldn't match up. That's the fact that this is a sphere with this, that they were feeling with, now that they had sight, the sphere that they were seeing for the first time. And I just think it's interesting that there is a translation problem between my truth and yours. What Stephen King always thought was the magic of writing is that he could take what was in his mind and magically put it into yours. But I'm not sure that he actually does that. He just thinks he does that.
He just thinks, because once it comes into mind, then I do with it what I want with it. I mean, I've had, there's a couple of times I've had clients quote me, or they'll say like, "Oh, I was talking to a friend and I thought of what you always say and I told them," and then something comes out of their mouth and I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting because that is not what I meant." But I'm glad it was useful, whatever it was. So I think I've been thinking about this as I debated whether or not to bring it up as a topic here. And I think the exact same thing that frustrates me or just annoys me about these things like the Yanni Laurel or the dress thingy is that the urge to argue it, it's like, well, no, this is what it says. Clearly, no, this is what it says. That to me is so inane because I'm like, it doesn't matter because the profound part is it is unignorable that the other person is hearing, like the fact that your truths don't match up is actually what is important. That the fact that you hear this and I hear that means that's our starting place. Is that you're hearing it this way and I'm hearing it this way. What do we do with that information? How do we utilize that? But it feels like instead of recognizing that, they just want to argue.
See, the interesting thing was because Nikki and the boys had heard this at home, and when I came home, they were actually having a conversation on this yesterday, and I caught the tail end of the conversation. What I was really interested in is that they were not arguing. They had taken what I think would be incredibly productive in a business meeting. They had taken that tone because I remember Alex was saying, "No, I hear Yanni." And Nikki was saying, "I only hear Laurel." I could have those reversed, but either way, they were on the opposite sides of that. Now, there wasn't rancor. There wasn't, Alex wasn't saying, "How could you be so stupid?" or anything. There wasn't outrage. There wasn't trying to persuade Nikki that no, what she really heard was Yanni and not Laurel. It was just kind of exploring and marveling in the differences. I find it really interesting that you see that or you heard that.
That makes me very happy. And I think that is easier to do in a situation like this where there isn't the trap to fall into of assuming that if another person hears Laurel when you hear Yanni, that's because you're wrong. Like, because it is distinct from any kind of reflected back to you value or judgment, I think it's easier to stay curious about like, oh, how is it that you hear that versus in a business situation, like I see this as a valuable way to go. I don't see this as a valuable way to go. I think the tendency more is to just argue that perspective sometimes, instead of being like, well, that's so interesting. Why do you, like, how is it that you see it that way? Being kind of marveling, as you said, at the, what is it that you see that I don't? Because sometimes people legitimately disagree. Often, though, I think it's just that they are standing in very different perspectives, like whether it's being filtered through different biology or different life experiences, or just literally different perspectives from standing in a different place in the organization. It's worth marveling at that and understanding it.
Well, I think one of the things that makes it easier to do with the Yanni versus Laurel is that back at my house, neither Nikki nor Alex in that situation believed that the other one could not physically hear. They didn't believe they didn't have the capacity to hear. So it wasn't like, well, you're too stupid to see my point. So you get to marvel at, well, I know you can hear, but it's so weird that you hear something different. Whereas a lot of times
and you don't even assume that your hearing is faulty.
No, you don't assume that it's faulty. You just like, it's so interesting that so you're treating each other as equals. We can both hear things.
Whole equals that have best intents.
Yes. Yeah. And nobody's lying. Nobody's fulfilling an agenda.
Nobody's trying to stick it to me. No one's trying.
So you're just saying, wow, you're curious. I just don't understand. How do you hear Laurel when I hear that? But you bring so much of those other extraneous things to a policy debate that maybe, first of all, if you don't start out with this respect, meaning somebody is also intelligent and experienced and working in the best interests of whatever you're trying to do, then you attack their motivations as opposed. So that's all gone with Yanni versus Laurel. You're not attacking motivations.
Yeah, it strips away that.
It strips away. And so I think that you're right, although I did roll my eyes internally a little bit when you brought up Yanni versus Laurel.
Oh, trust me, I was rolling my eyes at me bringing it up.
But I think you're right that's almost a recipe for how you can approach policy conversations.
Yeah. And the awareness that I posted this thing on Facebook, and I won't read the whole thing, but it was this interesting juxtaposition of how you see trees. Like you walk out into the forest and you see all these interestingly shaped trees, and some are straight and some are bendy and some are
right. I love this.
Yeah, and it said, and you look at that tree and you allow it. It was a Ram Dass quote. You look at that tree and you see why it is the way it is. That maybe it didn't get enough light, or maybe there was another tree in its way, so it bent this way. And you just you don't get emotional about it. That was the quote. You don't get emotional about it. You just allow it. You appreciate the tree, the shape that it is, because of the growth process that it has gone through. And that is what I so often feel like I'm doing in this like business couples therapy, is just helping someone else appreciate the tree the way it is. Doesn't mean, like, to be really clear, it doesn't mean you have to accept their behavior however it is. You just have to come at it without the sort of emotional blame and shame and whatnot that comes along with it, and just sort of the objective curiosity of like, you hear Laurel and I hear Yanni. Like, oh, you saw this thing that I was working with yesterday. Was that simple of a situation? Like, person A had made a decision to reply to people in a certain way. Person B had a very deep reason for feeling that should have been handled differently and tried to express it. Person A felt like their professional integrity was under attack. I mean, there was so much garbage and clutter and whatnot. All their different funky tree shapes were getting in the way of just a really interesting conversation they could have had if they could separate the two.
Right. And
isolate's probably a better word.
And I think in isolating that, I think that you have to allow for the why and the how questions. And that's just, I wonder, if you start kind of like Sarah Jessica Parker in Sex and the City. So I couldn't help but wonder. I wonder why you hear this. I wonder why you're saying this, as opposed to drawing your conclusion. You're saying this because you want to do X, Y, or Z. This
version comes, and instead of using that version to like draw it out of someone else, I think it's Brene Brown who is either Brene Brown or the woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. I can't remember. But she had this wonderful post about this phrase that she uses to have that same effect for herself when she's talking, is to sort of proactively get in front of that conversation. That when what she wants to say is, why did you leave me here without even thinking about, what I needed or whatever. She'll say, the story I'm making up is that you didn't think about, like, based on what happened, like, here's the story that I have crafted around that. And it's just sort of acknowledging that, like, this is the story that I am elaborating these facts into. Like, how do you see it? And I think I'll admit, I've tried to use it a couple of times and I feel a little bit silly using it, but I don't think that diminishes the value of the concept. Even if I'm thinking that in my head, I think I'm more able to articulate that feeling of like, okay, there are some facts here. It's like that peanut M&M thing. There's a peanut in the middle. Unfortunately, in this metaphor, it makes chocolate bad, but which is not my intent.
Yeah, that's not right.
It doesn't make sense. But there's this like nugget of truth, and then we wrap it in all this, unfortunately, bad chocolate of the story that we're making up about it. And sometimes that story is useful, and sometimes that story is really not useful. So just acknowledging that there's story around each of the facts, I think, is the difference. I think so that's it. That's what's so fascinating about the Laurel Yanni thing, is that it's lacking story. It's not confused by story. And so you can say that, like, here are two peanuts, two nuggets of truth in the middle. Even there's this massive discrepancy. So to me, it makes me wish that we could carry that empathy and awareness and curiosity into more complex things. If we can experience things that differently at such an isolated, variable way, just knowing that our chances of not having that same experience in more complex things is like zero.
Well, I think that the key really is, if you understand that most things, particularly in business, well, I won't say particularly in business because it's in life general, they're not just the peanut, they're not just the nugget, they're not devoid of story. Thank God, otherwise this podcast would be completely without reason.
So here's my bleep.
Yeah, so they're not devoid of story. So I think the skill comes in separating those two out, being able to discern the difference. So you said that with Brene Brown, and I think it is Brene Brown, although true confession, I started to read Eat, Pray, Love, but I think I only made it through Eat because I didn't finish the book, but I think it was Brene Brown. And I've used this actually almost word for word in negotiations or partnerships or meetings with companies or even in contracts, where I've said, okay, where we disagree here, the story that I'm telling myself is this. Or in the way I say it is, here's what's keeping me up at night. So yeah, it's. I don't think it's important that, or even an aspirational goal, to be able to come at each discussion with only the peanut, with only, strip everything away.
No.
But I do think the real value is being able to discern the difference between the peanut and the chocolate.
Yep.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group, as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.